Is a place of many dangerous and complex questions, and the answer, in whole or in part, to virtually every one of those questions is Iran. Why, after all, are we negotiating with the Islamic Revolution over their nuclear weapons program, but for the President's quest to harpoon the great white whale of a nuclear agreement with Iran? Why is Bashar al-Assad still in power years after the President said he must go, but for any reason because Iran views Syria as a legitimate sphere of interest, and the President has largely conceded that sphere? Why is the Secretary of State wrong-footing himself repeatedly on our policy with Syria? Because the President is now effectively allowing Assad to stay in power. Why are the Quds Force increasingly the dominant force inside of Iraq? And why is Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, a man with the blood of hundreds of American troops on his hand, showing up like a celebrity on Facebook and other social media throughout Iraq? Because Iran views Iraq as a sphere of its interest, and the West appears ready to grant that to Iran. Why did Yemen fall to Shiite militants that chant death to America and death to Israel? Again, because they're aligned with Iran. Why is our campaign against the Islamic State going so slowly and haltingly? Because we're more concerned about upsetting Iran's interest in the region. And why is Hezbollah still so strong in Lebanon? Because they remain Iran's terrorist cat's paw. In the face of all these negotiations with Iran and its drive for regional hegemony, the President has said repeatedly that he will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and that the threat of force remains on the table. However, Dr. Takei, you say on page 6 of your testimony, Iran today pointedly dismisses the possibility of U.S. military retaliation irrespective of its provocations. Would you care to elaborate on that?
I don't believe at this particular point that they take the threat of American military retribution seriously. They could be miscalculating. I mean, the history of international relations is a history of miscalculations. But I don't believe they see themselves as vulnerable to a military strike. And that's often the case when you have a diplomatic process. I mean, diplomatic process is something that nobody wants to disrupt by actually undertaking military action against one of the participants.
Do you believe that the President's refusal to enforce his own red line against Bashar al-Assad's regime in September of 2013 did anything to make Iran believe that he would not actually use the threat of force in any credible fashion?
As I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, the fact that we erased our red lines as carelessly as we drew them had an effect on the credibility of American deterrence.
Okay. Now I'd like to draw your attention to something you say shortly down the page on page 6. While America's military option has receded in the Iranian imagination, Israel still looms large. Fulminations aside, Iranian leaders take Israeli threats seriously and are at pains to assert their retaliatory options. It is here that the shape and tone of the U.S.-Israeli alliance matters most. Should the clerical regime sense divisions in that alliance, they can assure themselves that a beleaguered Israel cannot possibly strike Iran while at odds with its superpower patron.
Yes,
elaborate further?
Sure. I think that the divisions and the problems and tensions in U.S.-Israeli relations have not well affected Israeli deterrence posture as well, because the view of is that the two powers, Israel and United States, are in such disagreement. Again, that might be a miscalculation. Israeli officials and Israeli government has in the past used military force at the times when the United States did not approve of it. But at this point, I think the perception is that Israel is somewhat restrained in terms of its military posture because of the U.S.
Could that be because anonymous White House officials have been quoted in Western media reports saying that they have effectively delayed Israel's opportunity to strike Iran before they get a nuclear weapon?
I think such disclosures are not helpful, but I do think that I'm not entirely sure that Israel is bent on a military action against the Iranian nuclear facilities anyway, so we may be restraining a power that wants to be self-restrained.
Diplomacy is always more effective when backed by the credible threat of force, though, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Even if perhaps not the American credible threat of force.
Sure, yeah.
So, as you say, divisions in that alliance could undermine even that threat in the perception of Iran's leaders. And last week, in the aftermath of Benjamin Netanyahu's decisive victory in Iran, the President and many of his senior advisors made several statements that they would have to reconsider our relationship with Israel, that they might allow the United Nations or other international institutions take adverse action against Israel in an unfair and discriminatory pattern, as is their history. As you may also be aware, Ayatollah Khamenei gave his annual Nowruz message on Saturday, just 3 days ago, in which he whipped the crowd into frenzied chants of death to America. And his response was, yes, certainly, death to America. And yesterday, the president's spokesman said, that's just for domestic political consumption. Do you believe the reaction to Benjamin Netanyahu's statements in a democratic election versus the reaction to Ayatollah Khamenei's statement discredits Benjamin Netanyahu as a critic of the president's negotiations, undermines our relationship with Israel, and helps change our relationship with Iran?
Well, to separate the two issues, I do think that it's the interest of both the United States and Israel to get beyond the point of disagreements that they have and try to rehabilitate the alliance. And that's good for Israel, that's good for the United States, that's good for diplomacy toward Iran. As far as Ali Khamenei trying to satiate a domestic audience by chanting death to America, I don't know who that is. Most Iranians don't share his animosity toward America. So when he says those things, he actually is expressing his own opinion, an opinion of many hardline groups that share his essentially proscriptive ideology.
I suggest that when people chant death to America, we should take them seriously and reconsider whether we want to make nuclear concessions to such people and their regime. My time's expired. Thank you.